Our next and last concept in Unit 3 is land use. When we talk about land use and we take a look at the land use across the world, we know that 39% of our land is currently being used for crops, urban areas, and livestock. The remaining 61% consists of forests, wetlands, and other natural areas. And what this means is that we as humans have disturbed about 2/3 of all inhabitable land area for ourselves. In the United States, 48% of our land we use for agricultural and urban areas. The other 42% we set aside for public use, resource extraction, and wildlife. 35% of all of our land is owned by the federal government. Most of that public land is in Alaska, with just under 3/4 of it, and about 22% is in the western states. If you take a look at this map here, you can see the different uses for land across the United States, and they range from cropland, grazing forest, urban areas with such as parks and other special facilities, and then other land which would be desert, swamps, marshes. And you can see that if we start on the East Coast, the majority of our land use is taken up by forests. You can see that a lot of the East Coast is consisted of mountains. As you move to the west through central United States, we transition into much more cropland there in the Great Plains, which is where the majority of our food production takes place here in the United States. Then making our way even further west into grazing pasture lands, the wide open plains where it's free for animals to roam, and then finally further west on the west coast, when we get back to the mountains again, we end up with most of our land use back as forests and woodlands. For our U.S. public lands, we have 5 different types of public lands. The first of which is a multiple use public land, and that's the National Forest System. We have 155 national forests and 20 grasslands, which spans across 192 million acres. If you take a look at the picture of North Carolina in the bottom right there, you can see the large majority of our National Forest System in North Carolina is in the along the western border of North Carolina, out over near the mountains. We use our national forest for things like logging, mining, livestock grazing, some farming, oil extraction, recreational use, as well as hunting. And the forest system is managed by the U.S. Forest Service, which is a part of the Department of Agriculture. Another multiple use public land in the United States is National Resource Lands, and that is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And what we use these for is to provide us with a secure domestic supply of energy and minerals. That's where we know we have a supply if we need more, and also to use here domestically. A moderately restricted use public land would be the National Wildlife Refuge. We currently have 522 of them, They are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we use these protect habitats and other breeding areas for things like waterfowl, big game, so that way we can not only provide a harvestable supply for hunters, but we can also keep tabs and restrictions on the limits of the hunting of those species. Also in National Wildlife Refuges, we use these areas for fishing, oil development, mining, logging, and grazing, but those things all must occur with permits from the Department of the Interior. Anybody can't just go in to hunt or fish to start trying to log and develop the land without permission from the government. The 2 largest are the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge and the Desert National Wildlife Refuge. The ANWR is located obviously in Alaska. DNWR is located, the majority of which, in northern Nevada. Our restricted use public lands is the National Park System. We have 55 national parks and 324 national monuments. The other things that are included inside our park system are recreational areas, battlefields, parkways, and seashores. The national parks can only be used for camping, hiking, boating, and fishing. Hunting is not allowed inside the park system, neither is logging or mining. The national recreation areas do allow sport hunting, but those are located outside of the park. National parks in North Carolina, we have the Appalachian Trail, the Blue Ridge Parkway, Carl Sandburg Home, Fort Raleigh, Great Smoky Mountains, and the Guilford Courthouse, just to name a few. And our last restricted use public land is the National Wilderness Preservation System. This includes 630 roadless areas within another protected area. So these take place inside another protected area by the U.S. government, but we then take further measures where we ban motorized vehicles, logging, grazing, mining, as well as other buildings, so that way we do not disrupt the natural habitat of various species. A couple of the laws that we have in place to protect these natural areas. The first is the Wilderness Act, which was put in place back in 1964. And what this did is it defined a wilderness area. And it defined it as an area where the forces of nature and natural processes would be allowed to unfold without intentional human interference. And what that means is basically we determine this area to allow it to just be nature. We as humans cannot or should not go in and harm what is currently going on. 4 federal agencies have stewardship duties under the Wilderness Act. That's the National Park Service, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. The National Park Service is the largest federal agency under this act, and they control about 44 million acres of wilderness area. The Forest Service roughly 36 million, all the way down to the Bureau of Land Management, which controls about 9 million acres. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was put in place in 1968, and that was to preserve rivers and their immediate environments in a free-flowing and natural conditions, so that way we couldn't go in and do things like build dams and divert water away from the river for our own uses, for things such as irrigation or just a natural water supply. And up until this act was put in place, that was the main policy that we had in the United States, was to build these dams and to divert water so that way we had water in areas for people to use whenever they wanted, and we didn't take a look at the environmental impacts that we were causing. The river systems, they are classified as either wild, scenic, or recreational, and it all depends on the degree of development that existed at the time of their designation. So the most developed rivers are classified as recreational. The least developed are considered wild, and then kind of that in between is a scenic or beautiful look.